Next point, the conflict between the domestic and the existential, domestication and the existential experience, right? This is very, very important, and I want to make sure that I explain this thoroughly. All right, we are going to create a polemic, right? We're going to create two poles, right? So we have a pole right here, and on the other hand, we have another pole, right? And they're in opposition, right? The antithetical relationship. On one side of this polemical, conflictual relationship is the idea of domestication. And we know that domestication is a consequence of the banking concept of education, traditional educational system, passivity, docility, ... You should know that by now. On this end of the pole, we have the on this end of the pole, we have domestication. On this end of the pole, we have the existential, the lived experience of the oppressed individual. Quick refresher. Remember I said in the beginning of either this series or the initial series on Chapter 2 that the teacher makes an assumption that the student doesn't have any contribution. So the teacher lectures, and insofar as there's nothing that the student can inform me of, so that the information from the teacher, and obviously the teacher would be on this end, and the student would be on this end, is that information comes from me and this information goes to you, right? When we have this polemical, oppositional relationship, information only transfers, only flows this way, right? Right? And what are we doing? We are attempting to impose domestication, right? And where is domestication going over? We are attempting to impose domestication on, to confine, right? To imprison, if you will, the existential experience of the oppressed, right? It is an imposition of domestication on the lived experience of the student. It is the imposition of domestication on the existential experience of the oppressed. So if you're talking about this imposition of domestication on the existential experience, you can talk about it in terms of its pedagogical, educational function on the student, or its social implications function on just subordinate populations, right? All right. How is this done in the education model? Now, this is my part, right? This is me. I would say that it's done in an educational model. This idea of banking, right? Freire doesn't say this explicitly, but Freire would want me to draw my own conclusions from his text rather than just regurgitate his text. So I am not going to sit here and just tell you what Freire said. I'm going to tell you what Freire said, but I'm also going to tell you Jason's interpretation of Freire. And when you talk to me, you should tell me what Freire said, my interpretation of Freire, and then your response to my interpretation of Freire, and your interpretation, and so on. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. My interpretation of Freire, with respect to the educational model, is one of an attempt to impose on the lived experience of the student the canon. Right? So the canon, for me, the canon becomes this tool of domestication. I was a young, black, disaffected, hip-hop male in immigrant male in American society, and I listened to hip-hop music, and my life was anything but, typical. And there I am with my own experiences as a male. Imagine that you were a woman. Imagine that you were a poor white kid, right? Imagine that you pick what you want to be. You have a rich white kid, right? You have your own personal experience, right? Regardless of what it is. There is no better or worse than. There is no more, there's no in this sense, right? There is no more privileged or less privileged. As a fact, you just have your experience, right? You have your experience, your lived experience. The canon in education is, and the canon is comprised of, right, and is a composition of all of the recognized and required standards and norms and text and referential blah, blah, blah that students have to know. So in any English class anywhere in the United States of America, students leaving with a high school education will have read a little bit of Shakespeare. They'll probably read One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, or they'll read you know, Charlotte's Web. They'll read you know, what is it? Lord of the Flies. You know, like all of these different texts and these poems and these speeches they comprise the canon. And insofar as they comprise the canon becomes a means of controlling, right? The canon's a means of controlling. I'm a philosophy student. I have never ever sat in a class, and I had a very good education, but I have never sat in a class where I critically analyzed Fanon's text, unless I was taking sort of like African American philosophy or psychoanalytical implications of, right? You don't read Fanon. Outside of a feminist course, I very rarely ever heard about Judith Butler, right? What's Butler? Who is she? I don't even know what she's talking about, right? Within a feminist course, sure, I hear a lot about it, right? Within an African American or critical race theory course, oh sure. But just in the canon itself, it's like the canon has a particular way of formalizing thought, right? To become a philosopher, to become a sociologist, to become an anthropologist, to become a geologist, you need to read these canonical texts, right? And that's the aspiration of all eager young academics, is to create that canonical text. Well, I hope I don't create a canonical text, because I'm not trying to impose my thought. I just want to write another book, right? I don't want my book to be the book, right? It's too much of an obligation, right? So the idea of the canon is an attempt to domesticate, right? It is an introduction, it's an indoctrination, it is a mode of being like the other, right? It is this, like, as we said before, the outside. Your experiences existentially are inconsequential. Who cares that you're a poor white girl from, you know, middle America? Sucks for you, right? Who cares that you're a poor, impoverished black kid from the urban areas? Sucks for you, right? You want to become a philosopher, you want to become a mathematician, you want to become a geologist, here's what you need to learn. And I don't care about your experience, just learn it, right? Well, that's problematic, right? The canon becomes the device of oppression. That's more me. But I think that's an implication, obvious, and I think it's an obvious implication of Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed, right? Next point, the existential experience shows that reality is a process, right? Not bits of information, right? So the fact that individual students, individual members of an oppressed class have their own lived experience demonstrates, right, and should demonstrate, this is an ethical claim, right, should demonstrate to the teacher, the instructor, that there is an opportunity for them to teach me, right? We're not saying, I'm not saying at least, that we need to get rid of the canon, right? I understand that the canon has a role. You want to become a philosopher, I can't really talk to you and look at you as a credible philosopher if you have no idea of who Immanuel Kant is, or David Hume is, or Spinoza, right? If you don't know these seminal, you know, if you don't know the difference between rationalism and empiricism, I can't really respect you as, and you claim to be a professor, I can't respect you as a colleague, because this is like the most introductory level of philosophical discussion, right? We all know that. That's a given. So there is a role of the canon. I'm not saying to get rid of the canon. However, the canon cannot be so rigid that it is not capable of incorporating the Judith Butlers, the Frantz Fanons, the transsexual theory, the radical theory, the liberation theory into the canon. If those things aren't part of the canon, then the canon is crap. The canon always has to be subject to change. It's always in a process of unfolding, of developing, of incorporating, of becoming more inclusive. If the canon is not doing that, then to hell with the canon.